This is Conversations from Carthage, and I'm Robert Bonomo. And our first guest is Tarek Kahlaoui, Professor of History and International Relations at Southern Mediterranean University. Welcome.
Hey Rob, and well, thank you, because this is, I think, I'm the first...
You're our first guest.
Yeah, that's an honor.
Excellent. So can you tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I teach here History and International Relations in SMU, South Mediterranean University in Tunisia. I teach mainly in the Mediterranean School of Business. So SMU has like two main schools, one in business, MSB, and another one in engineering, MedTech. They have also a language center. And they're expanding. They started actually early on, in the beginning of the 2000s, and then they really expanded after the revolution, beginning of 2011, 2012. And I would say it's the major private English-speaking university, and it's moving slowly but surely at actually projecting an image of a major university outlet when it comes to business and engineering, specifically when it comes to English-speaking courses. So it's becoming one of the major, I think, universities here, and maybe in North Africa. I mean, one of the few English-speaking universities, because you know, in North Africa, the main language spoken, in addition to Arabic, is French. It's mainly a francophone culture. So it's one of the new things happening in Tunisia, and well, since a few years, many things new are happening in Tunisia, and we're going to talk about that.
Exactly. So that's kind of why I wanted to have you as our first guest, to give us a little bit of context, because I think a lot of the people listening will be English speakers. And so just to give us a little bit of context of where we are in Tunisia historically, because there's so much history here, and it's such a blend of histories, no?
Yeah, actually, I got my PhD in the US, in UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. And the first time I went there, it's usually the same problem. Whenever I would be asked, where are you from? I would say Tunisia. They would ask me again, Indonesia? No, it's not Indonesia, it's Tunisia. It's the same thing happening for anyone who goes from Tunisia to the US. Tunisia is not maybe famous in the English-speaking world, in the Anglophone world, but certainly Carthage is famous. And Carthage, which its name has been borrowed by many cities worldwide, Cartagena, Carthage, it was a major city port in the Mediterranean about 2,500 years ago. So by that time, by 500 BC, Carthage would be, I would say, the ruling city in the Mediterranean.
And how important were the Phoenicians, because Carthage was a Phoenician city, in all Mediterranean culture as far as language, money? Weren't the Phoenicians were the ones who came up with one of the first monies in the Mediterranean?
Yeah, with the Greeks. It was like a competition. So the Phoenicians, which is where Lebanon is today, the Phoenicians were known for two things: for their language, which is one of the Semitic languages. It's written from right to left. It's one of the languages from which we have other languages like Hebrew, Arabic. And they were known for another thing, which is they were good merchants, as the Lebanese now. The Lebanese are still good merchants. We can find them everywhere, in Africa and Latin America and so on and so forth. So, since they were good merchants, the main activity was throughout the Mediterranean, not inland, it was throughout the coasts.
Right.
And they built a maritime empire, and they had like city ports throughout the Mediterranean. One of these city ports became a center in itself that really overshadowed the Phoenicians themselves later. So this started, let's say, 800 BC. That's where Carthage, that's where, and basically Carthage is believed to be built using some textual sources, archaeology, around 800 BC. And little by little, about 1 or 2 centuries, there was this fusion between the Phoenicians who came here and the local inhabitants.
What was the name of the local inhabitants?
Well, it's difficult to give them a name, but let's say it's what we call today the Amazigh, the Berbers.
Mm-hmm.
It's the local population, and later we're gonna have this fusion, and we're gonna have what we can call the Punic civilization, which is the
fusion
mixture.
of the two.
The Phoenicians and the native inhabitants of North Africa at that time. Since then, and I would say 600 BC, around that time, Carthage became a center itself that was projecting an empire, the empire of Carthage, little by little, throughout the Western Mediterranean and even on the Atlantic coast of Africa.
Caliph was a Phoenician city, wasn't it?
Yes. And many of these cities actually were flourishing, were basically a phenomenon of very flourishing trade activity throughout the Mediterranean. And this is way before the Romans became a major empire.
One question, when we say Phoenician and Punic, is there a difference?
It's, as I said, it's the fusion between the Phoenicians and the local inhabitants here.
That's Punic.
So what we call Punic is that kind of fusion, which is not very different from Phoenician. So let's, for instance, take an example of the language. The language is very close between Punic and Phoenician. And so something happened there, 600 BC. And it was not only a trade empire, a mercantile empire, it became also a military empire. The Phoenicians were very good at that time in building ships. The technology of shipment, of basically navigation was highly mastered by these guys.
How far did they go? Because I know they went at least to Caliph.
Yes, and they went throughout the coast of Africa.
Down.
And they built up. It was a series of city ports and trade ports that would allow them to establish a network of trade between different regions with different resources, agricultural resources. As you know, at that time, the economy is based mainly on agriculture.
Right.
But there was the part of trade, and they were making money out of that. It was small, but still very important. Basically trading between regions that are producing different agricultural products. And with that, it came another activity, which is handcrafts, basically pottery, textile. So they were good at that, especially in pottery. Their pottery is known to be black. So in archaeological excavations, if you find something like this cup, basically this glass with a black, basically painting, and from that period, that's Punic. That's from this empire.
Now, one question: their mythology. They had some of their mythology, I think, sometimes gets confused with the Roman mythology.
Yeah.
But what was their basic mythology?
It's different. I would take as an example their main goddess, which is called Tanit. Tanit is this female goddess, and it was seen as the source of fertility. And it was different than Greek mythology, but they did share something between.
And Tanit comes from Astarte, right? The Phoenician goddess Astarte?
Yeah. Ashtart.
Right, comes out Tanit. But Tanit was always associated with the moon, right?
Yeah. And it's, for them, the lunar year, the lunar system is essential as the solar system. So the lunar system has been very popular in Eastern culture, in Middle Eastern culture in general. That's why Muslims use the Hijri calendar, which is a lunar calendar.
A lunar calendar.
Yes. But going back to this maritime empire, it was for them. It was not a culture that is closed into North Africa. Since it was maritime, it was open to the other cultures, And that's why, even in terms of religion, they shared
Right.
some of the myths, they shared some of the narratives, religious narratives of the Mediterranean. So I would say it was a Mediterranean empire rather than a North African empire. And, usually people who work at the sea, they have their lingua franca. It is a mixture of the different cultures and languages of the sea, because the sea is a frontier, but at the same time it's a platform of interaction between different cultures. So because it was maritime empire, it was open culturally to other cultures and to other religions and to other symbols.
One question, how important was the Phoenician language in the Mediterranean?
So as I said, it's at the beginning it was the Phoenician language that is important, but little by little we had these local variations of Phoenician language, like Punic, in North Africa.
But it's completely gone, right? There's no vestige of...
Well, yes, you have few experts who are still very well introduced in these languages. For Punic, for instance, in Tunisia, we have Hassin Fanter, who's one of the main history professors. His field is Punic history and archaeology, and he's one of the few people who are really into.
But it's not spoken in there's no modern Punic language.
No.
Because I remember somebody said Maltese. There was some debate about whether Maltese had a Punic origin.
What's interesting about places like Malta, about these islands in the Mediterranean, they have to be like carriers of the past, but at the same time places for fusion. And that's why we find even in Maltese language words not only from the Arabic language, but even from Tunisian dialect. And so for instance, they say al-Barraniya meaning the outsiders, which is a word we use in our Tunisian dialect, not even in the Arabic language. So Malta is open into to Italian, Greek, French, Arabic, Tunisian cultures. And that's the fate of many of these islands, like Crete, like Corsica, and so on and so forth. So going back to the Punic Empire, what was interesting is that as it was building up at the same time, a trade empire, a military empire, these two sides open to the Mediterranean, controlling most of the Western Mediterranean, including city-ports along today's Spain, France, Italy, and so on and so forth. There was something that was building up little by little by the 4th century BC, specifically the Roman Republic, the Republic of Rome, and that was the first challenge to the Punic Empire, to Carthage.
One question,
and then became this major basically competition between these two powers to control the Mediterranean.
But what about the relations with the Greeks?
Well, it was an interesting relationship. It was like dividing the Mediterranean between themselves.
Oh, I
so
see.
the Greeks, mainly in the Eastern Mediterranean, they were present in the Western Mediterranean, but as the Punic Empire, as Carthage was building up, they were sidelining the Greeks. The Greek language was spoken in Sicily, in places, but as the Punic Empire was building up, they were sidelining, overshadowing in the Western Mediterranean.
The Greek. But the Greeks adopted the Punic alphabet, correct?
Yes, it was obviously Semitic languages, including Punic languages, are basically the basis for many languages, including European languages, Greek and even Latin afterwards.
And then the Romans take the Greek alphabet, but the origin of the modern Latin alphabet is the Punic alphabet, correct?
Well, if we go through the tree to the basics of the origins, yes, not only Punic, but the Semitic languages are seen as pioneering languages when it comes to the building of languages. So, and then there was the fight. And this is going to be like a pattern. The fight between Carthage and Rome is going to establish a pattern of conflicts between the southern and the northern Mediterranean. And we're going to see this line of each time we're going to have a major center coming either from the south or from the north, and trying to establish itself as the empire of the Mediterranean. Because at that time, yes, there was China, there was the Indian Ocean, but really the Mediterranean cultures were somehow basically very powerful. And China was the other world, basically, but we can say that there was a Mediterranean world where we have these different centers trying to control the other side. So it's either Carthage or Rome or Constantinople or Cairo or Baghdad and Damascus, which are not really Mediterranean, but still they are very close. They embrace this Mediterranean culture of monotheism that started with Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam. So it's basically a very close environment. It was like a lake, the Mediterranean, that is open to these different cultures. They are different, but at the same time they were feeding each other. So we can say that one of the starting points of this very long narrative of competition, of interaction at the same time, is going to start around the basically 5th century BC, 4th century BC, between Rome and Carthage.
Rome and Carthage. I just want to say, I actually lived in Cartagena in Spain.
No.
Until today, they still celebrate Romanos y Cartageneros. So some people dress up as the Punics and the Romans, and they reenact the battles. It's still really an important part of their culture.
Yeah, in Spain that seems like it goes even for in Cordoba they have a festival like that. And it's well, memory stays in. I mean, even though we have like more than 2,000 years away from these events, from these wars, from the Punic Wars, it's still there in the memory. And this fight was the source of many myths, of a lot of imagination and of a lot of inspiration. So when we say Hannibal, when we say military strategy, when we say basically the building up of a major army like the Roman army, it's because of the Punic Wars. Rome as an empire came out of this competition
from the
with Carthage.
From the first, because the initial battles were very
Punic, of course. No, the first Punic Wars clearly because of their maritime powerful fleet. The Punic were clearly. The Punic army was highly powerful, was stronger. But little by little, the Romans had the opportunity to learn from how to build ships, how to build quicker ships, more powerful ships, how to fight well in the sea. And from there, they started to overcome the Carthaginians. And their main target was certainly Carthage.
Right.
And basically Hannibal, as he was searching for revenge after they lost one of these wars to the Romans, and he devised the strategy of actually, instead of attacking by sea, going throughout the Europe, the Alps, and through Spain.
From Cartagena up.
It was basically a huge achievement. The Romans never thought that they're going to have the Carthaginian army coming from there, from
with
these
elephants,
mountains, and with elephants. That was one of the innovations of Hannibal, using them as we use tanks today. And and people are still trying to retrace his path from where he went, and how would his army would survive in these very harsh circumstances. So it's a major military
Hannibal was a true military genius, though.
Yes.
I mean, he still studied those battles today.
Yes, and in military academies, it's still a major source of inspiration. But I would say he's not given yet basically what he deserves in terms of tribute. I'm still waiting for a major movie about Hannibal. There was actually talk about something that was going to happen like 10 years ago, but this is a historical figure that needs to be celebrated as one of the major historical figures, in human history as a military man, but also as a strategist, as a tactician, the way he led his army, how as a politician, how he actually was able to, in a very mixed, very heterogeneous army, have to make them one group and one team was already an achievement. Because, you know, the Carthaginian army was not based mainly on North African fighters. It was based partly on mercenaries, including from Spain, including from Sub-Saharan Africa, including from Mauritania at that time. So it was not it was not an easy task to do that. So it's so one of his achievements is how he made his group basically into cohesion. He lost the final battle by the end, but as many say, he's good in strategy, but in finishing up the task, he was not up to the task. And finally, the Romans just went to Carthage and destroyed it as they decided, because for them it was essential to finish up the city, to destroy the city, to burn the city to the ground. And it only after many years, many decades, they decided actually to rebuild Carthage, Roman Carthage, after actually after putting the old Carthage into ground.
So, the Punic period ends with the Roman takeover. How long did the Roman period last?
Well, the Roman period is going to last, well, until basically the Byzantines are going to come in.
400 or 500 BC?
Yeah.
Or AD?
Yeah, about 400 or 500 years. And they really changed the landscape.
The Romans did?
Yes. And
how so? How did things really change?
They changed the paradigm of the empire in North Africa from being a maritime empire based mainly on the coasts into an agricultural empire. It's going to be one of the sources of basically shipping wheat to and supporting
back to Rome.
Back to Rome. Rome was being fed, including by wheat from North Africa, and specifically from Africa, or what we call in Tunisian dialect and Arabic language, Ifriqiya or Phrygia, which is basically the northern part of Tunisia, one of the most fertile agricultural lands. And it was at the same time a location of major cities like Dogga, and then also to the south, Spatla, Sufaitila, and all of these regions. So olive, wheat, all of these agricultural products were meant to feed Rome, but at the same time, in Tunisia, many major urban centers were being built, were flourishing, in addition to Carthage. And it was another, basically, page in the glorious history of North Africa.
But Carthage remained the most important city still.
Yes.
And the name remains the same.
It's going to come back again with the same name as the major center in North Africa, urban trade center in North Africa. It's going to become an urban Roman city. And with the Romans, what was going to happen, especially with the empire, is that we're going to see this door that's going to open for anyone who's native to become a Roman citizen.
Okay.
That promotion, that door for citizenship, is going to make everyone basically contained with the Roman Empire. At the same time, keeping on the side a bit of their culture. So Punic culture, Libyc culture, that's one of the other names of the local culture, is going to be preserved for years underneath this Roman Latin basically culture. So we're going to have a dual identity for some time. And so those are the early basically centuries of the glorious days of the Roman Empire, the first and the second century. And then we're going to have also basically this new religion coming into the scene, And one of the places that's going to be popular in is North Africa. That is Christianity. Christianity is going to become popular in North Africa.
Augustine spent time in Carthage, right?
Of course, yeah. He was basically his North African figure. He's from Nippon, and he's like this major Christian scholar who's coming from basically from the margins of the.
What's interesting is he was a Manichaean. And in Carthage, there was a Manichaean bishop.
Yeah. So you have different Christian groups in North Africa, and as I said, Christianity is going to become big in terms of its culture, and that's why when Islam is going to conquer North Africa, it's going to take some time for Christianity to disappear. So when Muslims came in the middle of the 7th century, after the Byzantines, after the Vandals. They're going to spend about 1 to 2 centuries Arabizing, Islamicizing the region, but Christianity is going to remain for some time before disappearing, basically in the 9th, 10th centuries AD, when it really is going to...
If the Vandals were here, you see that in like Bizerte, no? People with the blue eyes, isn't that a vestige of Vandals?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but yes, it's difficult to really pin down specifically why people in Bizerte are like that. But, part of Berber identity is also blue eyes. You can find that in the northwestern part of Tunisia. Main parts in Algeria and in the Qbayl region, so that's not necessarily an indication of coming from the north. So with Islam, things are gonna. So we have a glorious period of agricultural and urban flourishment with the Romans until the 4th, 5th century AD. Then we had periods of difficulties, ups and downs with the Byzantines, the Vandals. When the Muslims came in, as they did in Syria, in Egypt, they found already the region in difficulties. As they did in Spain.
In Spain,
it's the same thing. It's the North Africa and Spain they were going through major economic difficulties, wars, and so on and so forth. So they built up on the past. They revived somehow Roman technology, especially in building dams, in building major cisterns, hydraulic installations, fortifications. They built on the Roman Byzantine traditions, but at the same time they had their own contribution.
Sure.
And in the beginning they were not very keen into having a maritime empire in the 1st century, like 7th century AD, 8th century AD, but little by little they built their own empire in the sea, and it's going to become really powerful with the Fatimids in the 10th century. So the Fatimids, this big Mediterranean empire that's going to build Cairo, one of the biggest cities in the world, they started from Tunisia. They started right here, and they built the city we call Mahdiya on the coast. They built actually one of the biggest arsenals in the Mediterranean in Mahdiya. It's still there. There are the archaeological remnants of that in the city of Mahdiya. So that's a big maritime empire right there that started in Tunisia. Again, it was like retracing back the Punic tradition of a major maritime
Did they
empire.
keep Carthage as the center?
No, Carthage is gonna come back, not as Carthage, but as the city of Tunis.
And when does that change?
It's going to happen mainly 12th, 13th centuries, little by little. So they went on from Qayrawan to Mahdiya, then back to Qayrawan, and then they went to Tunis. And that's going to happen with a dynasty that's known as the Hafsids. It's a little tribe that came from Morocco. What's going to happen at some point is that, so the Islamic history of Tunisia and North Africa is the following, basically. And this is just summarizing, maybe too much, but this is overall what's going to happen. First, the first centuries of Islam, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, it was built on tribes, Arab tribes, on narratives of religious groups that were coming from the East, from the Middle East. Then, by the 12th, 13th centuries, we're going to see another wave, which is the Berber wave. The Berbers are going to become again the rulers with Islam, they're going to be Islamicized, they're going to be Muslim, but it's going to be mainly Berber tribes. And Berber tribes are going to rule North Africa for many centuries, beginning from the 11th, 12th century.
With speaking Arabic?
Arabic is going to become the main language. We're going to here have a dual identity. We're going to have basically a day-to-day rural identity, the identity of the mountains, which is still Berber, and we're going to have the identity of the cities, of urban centers, of the elite, of the written culture, which is Arabic. But overall, Islam was accepted as the religion of the cities and of the rural spaces. It's going to be different. In the rural spaces, it's going to be more like a mystic religion, like a Sufi religion, basic, a popular version of Islam. In the city, it's going to be the classical version of Islam, based on clear legal, basically restrictions and theses. Basically, Tunisia was, especially via Qayrawaan and then Tunis, is going to come back as a major center of learning, especially in two universities, the University Mosque of Qayrawaan and then the University Mosque of Zaytuna in Tunis. And many people, many students from sub-Saharan Africa, from different regions throughout North Africa are going to come to Tunis and to learn religion, but also other sciences. Because what's happening in these university mosques, they were not only teaching religion, they were teaching mathematics, they were in some cases teaching basically physicians, they were medicine, they were teaching astronomy, astrology. So all of these fields were taught in these university mosques. And in North Africa, we can say Tunisia, the University Mosque of Qayrawaan, and then of Zaytuna, were centers, major centers of learning throughout the Islamic period.
Now, we don't want to race through history too much, but we kind of want to get close to the current time. So then the Ottomans come.
Yeah.
And when does that happen, and how does that happen?
Well, what's going to happen is that in the 16th century, the Mediterranean is going to have another phase of that history that we talked about, the north and south. This basically competition. You're going to have two major challengers in the Mediterranean, and these were, in the 16th century, the Ottomans, coming basically from modern-day Turkey, but they expanded their empire through Syria, Egypt, and then North Africa up to Morocco. They never actually were successful to control Morocco. That's the only place in North Africa they were not able to conquer. And on the other side, we have the Spanish Empire.
And
so
the
it was
right.
like the big fight between these two maritime empires. And then we have Barbarossa on the Ottoman Empire side. And the Ottoman Empire, the way it was acting and it was fighting, it was very similar to Hannibal's structure, Hannibal's army structure. It was based partly on mercenaries. It was partly, not all of the members of the Ottoman army and Barbarossa's army that conquered Tunisia at the beginning, in the middle of the 16th century. They were not all Muslims. Many of them were just basically mercenaries, Christians coming from Italy, coming from Greece, coming from the Balkans. But they were like a franchise for the Ottoman army. They had like the approval and to use the Ottoman flag. And that's how the Ottomans were able to conquer many parts of the Eastern
They were very
Mediterranean.
decentralized, right?
Yes, it was like exactly like that. It was decentralized. As I said, it was like a franchise.
Even Tunisia,
you have the
there was a lot of self-rule, even though it was...
That's true. As we get away from Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, so the Ottomans, when they conquered by the middle of the 15th century, when they conquered Constantinople, they're going to call it, basically rename it Istanbul. So as they moved away from Istanbul, their power is going to get little by little decentralized. So when they're going to rule Libya, then Tunisia, then Algeria, local powers here, the beys, the deys, that are going to rule.
The bey was the local ruler.
Yes,
right?
it was first the Basha and then the Bey. They were mainly Basha Days and Beys. This is like the series of rulers that ruled Tunisia between the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. They built little by little some kind of independence. They were like part of the Ottoman Empire, but at the same time they were like ruling aside from Istanbul. They had their own treaties. They're going to have their own treaties with other European powers little by little.
But in modern Tunisian culture, there's a strong Ottoman influence. You still see
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
It's in foods, certain maybe
Yes.
linguistically.
And we have Ottoman influence that is part of our culture. But you know, what I would say, there was some kind of fusion between Ottoman culture, and I would insist on Ottoman rather than Turkish, because many of these guys who came here were of European background, not necessarily Turkish background. They were speaking different languages, including Italian and French, and so they were not necessarily Turks. But they were part of this new elite, the Ottoman elite, and the local Arabic elite. There was some kind of fusion. There was the word that represented, like Punic represented that fusion.
Right. So you see it again. No?
Yeah, the word that represented that fusion is Kurghli. Kurghli is this fusion between the Turks, the Ottomans, and the local Arab and Berber tribes. And that especially happened in the beginning of the 18th century, 1700s. It's going to happen, that clear fusion between the Ottoman elite and the local elite. But Tunis is going to become again one major center with Marseille, with Italian city-states, and it's gonna be this major trade center that is different than the other Ottoman centers. Like Algiers was mainly a center of maritime fighters or pirates, basically, as is the case in Tripoli. But there was piracy in Tunisia at that time, but it was mainly an economy of trade and agriculture. It was an essential part of the local economy, which is not exactly the case in Algeria, which was known for basically religious or jihad. That is the maritime jihad, as it's called at that time. Tunisia had piracy, but not as much as was the case.
But do you think it harks back to the Punic idea of being a maritime commercial culture?
Yes,
maybe it never lost that.
Yeah, it's still until now. It's this tendency of, as we say in French, donnant donnant. That is, basically scratch my back and I scratch your back. Basically, this idea of exchange, of interaction, and this closeness to Italy, to France, and to the other Eastern Mediterranean ports. You know, Tunis had, and Susa and the other city ports along the Tunisian coast had a very active relationship with Alexandria, with Algiers. So it was part of this maritime network. And Muslim merchants, especially from this island of Jerba, but also Jewish merchants who were living in Tunisia were a big part in this trade network.
When did that happen? Did that happen when they were expelled from Spain?
Well, that's another group that came in. We had Jews in Tunisia since basically since the Roman times.
Since the Roman times,
and even before. But there were different layers of Jewish migrants from Spain, from Italy, from Livorno, and other European cities. So it's not only one layer of Jews, and you know there is also a hierarchy within the Jewish community between the local Jews and the European Jews.
Right.
So
Yes.
so it's gonna stay a major trade commercial space until basically the French occupation that's going to happen by the end of the 19th
So the French occupation ends the Ottoman period?
Yes. Well, basically the Ottoman period went into different phases. So what we have in the 19th century is a local Ottoman rule, Tunisian rule. We can say that the Tunisian modern state started to shape in the middle of the 19th century.
Emerging out of the Ottoman period.
Yeah, before the French occupation. So the French occupation, somehow, they were behind the rupture of this natural growth of the Tunisian modern state, because they started reforms in the middle of the 19th century by the influence of the Ottoman Tanzimat, Ottoman reforms, and they started their own constitution, the first constitution, and in the middle of the 19th century, 1860s. So it was really the beginnings of the modern state, and that all stopped with the French occupation. And basically, the French occupation, when they came in, they said, "Okay, you're not grown up enough. You're gonna be under our protection," and that's why it was called protectorate.
The second half of the 19th century is that expansion of European colonialism into Africa, all of Africa.
Yes, of course. It started with Algeria in 1830, and it's gonna expand throughout North Africa. The French and the British in Egypt, and so on and so forth. And that's a new era, basically, after that.
And that gets us relatively close to where we are, but I think for today, that's a lot. No?
Yes,
so we'll
that's
definitely
ready to digest, basically.
I think we definitely have to have you on again.
Yeah.
You can bring us
I'd be glad
from
to.
that Ottoman period up to the modern.
I would be glad to.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
For Conversations from Carthage, this is Robert Bonomo.